Hello everyone, and this is James at Gas Gas Gas. We're continuing on the themes of diagrams or die, and we're going to look at the cardiac pressure volume loop. And most of the focus is going to be on what's occurring in the left ventricle during the cardiac cycle. References for the content today is content from Guyton and Hall, page 109 onwards. Basic Physiology for Anaesthetists, page 135 and onwards, and then the FRCA in a box content 151, 152. Learning objectives for today. As always, you need to be able to draw the diagram, so we're going to draw a cardiac pressure volume loop. We're going to label it, we're going to describe what the darn thing represents, and then we're going to describe and explain how changes to. So herein lies our pressure volume loop. I've already started drawing a few bits of the diagram just to make a bit of progress. Naturally, next step is to label axes. So along the bottom we have left ventricular volume, and this is in mils. And then along the side we have left ventricular pressure. And we go with millimeters of mercury for that. So I've labelled it, we've got to get some sensible sounding numbers on here. And if you recall back to sensible pressures that occur in the left ventricle and sensible volumes that occur in the left ventricle, we know it gets almost all the way down to zero pressure at some point in the cycle, and we know that there's a event where it reaches maximal systolic pressure and maximal diastolic pressure. Equally, we assume an approximation of how much blood is in the ventricle at the start and end of the cycle as well. So if you recall those numbers, then you can quite easily label this up. And for this, we're going to say that at the beginning of an empty ventricle cycle, there's 50 mils of blood still sat in the LV. And then at the end of filling, we're going to say there are 120 mils in the LV. We're going to say that the systolic pressure, which is going to be this point D over here, we'll call that 120, and our diastolic body over here, we'll call 80. So we're going to, at point A, down here, this is where the ventricle is at the lowest pressure and also the emptiest. And if you think back to your cardiac cycle, that's going to be the point at the end of isovolumetric relaxation and the beginning of diastolic filling. B over here is going to be the end of diastolic filling, and that's because the ventricle's got to 120 mils volume, and therefore it's not going to fill up any further. So you can assume that that's the end of diastolic filling and the beginning of isovolumetric contraction, i.e. the amount in the ventricle isn't changing isovolume, but contraction is occurring and pressure is escalating up to point C. At point C, ventricular emptying begins, i.e. we're tracking back towards D on our loop, so therefore we know that ejection is happening from the ventricle, ventricular ejection, and we return back to between D and A, where the ventricle is at high pressure but volume is depleted, so we are isovolumetric once again, and we are relaxing. So I'm just going to go ahead and quickly label those. So James, you're going to cut this bit out, so it's just a snap between labeling this code. the cycle goes from there to there to there and back that way. So at point A, filling of the ventricle must occur, therefore a valve has to open between the left atrium and the left ventricle. So our dear friend A over here is the mitral valve opening. From that, B must be the mitral valve closing. So C, we've hit maximal pressure with no ejection of volume, so the aortic valve must open at this point for volume to leave the ventricle in a normal heart. So, other things to add here, which might just make it easier to conceptually visualize what's going on, is if I draw a bit of a dotted line coming down here, through here to through here is your stroke volume, and 120 minus 50 is 70 mils, which is an arbitrary average stroke volume in most people. Also consider this point to be left ventricular end systolic volume, left ventricular end diastolic volume. B as a point also represents left ventricular end diastolic pressure. D represents left ventricular end systolic pressure. Many acronyms, but you can always work them out based on RV, LV, P at the end, V at the end, etc. So if you can draw all that out in an exam and point out everything that we've talked about here, you're probably making good progress. Okay, so that is our overview of the cardiac pressure volume loop. However, there are more lines to add, and we will go through that next. So, more lines. You couldn't possibly imagine there are more lines, surely. Well, naturally there are. They love them. We love them. Physiologists love lines. So, relationships between the pressure and the volume. And there are two ones we talk about. There's the end systolic pressure volume relationship. It goes through a 0 on the axis and up through the D point, like that. And we call this the end systolic PVR, pressure volume relationship. And the gradient of this line describes contractility. If the line were to pitch up more towards the pressure axis, it would represent positive inotropy. If it were to swing away and down towards the volume axis, naturally, you've guessed it, demonstrates negative inotropy. So the next thing to tell you about is the end diastolic pressure volume relationship to EDPVR. So the idea is it goes through from the 0 point of the axis along the AB line, but then starts accelerating off and up afterwards. And diastolic pressure volume relationship. What does this line represent? So this demonstrates the passive compliance of the left ventricle. So if systole was to take longer to happen, so there's a greater period of diastole, progressively more filling would occur, and you might start to see the beginning of your pressure volume loop further up this line. However, at some point the volume stops really increasing, but the gradient of the curve suggests that the pressure in the ventricle starts rising much more rapidly than the volume does. Imagine this in that the ventricle can only fill so much, and therefore if you're trying to cram more blood into a progressively stiffer space, pressure must rise. This can be demonstrated in pathological processes by stiffer ventricles in patients with hypertrophy, whereby their diastolic pressure might be higher. Two more important lines with which to talk about. So this is the passive compliance. So eventually filling slows, pressure escalates. and those where are more lines. Moving on to work done, we're going to talk about some measured energies that are exerted and some potential energies. So in our cardiac pressure volume loop area, we've got something called the external work. If you were to take the pressure and times it by the volume, this external work is the work done by the left ventricle to eject blood from the aorta, from the ventricle into the aorta. Work is pressure times volume, and it's measured in joules. If you were to consider this over the time it takes for a whole cycle to complete, you could then divide that number by the seconds, and you'd end up with joules per second, which is a watt. Whereas this A area you could describe as the potential energy of the circuit, or the pressure work, or the internal work. And this is the energy expended in isovolumetric contraction, i.e. the amount of energy exerted to get to a point where you're ejecting blood from the ventricle. All of this work added together correlates reasonably well with the oxygen consumption of the left ventricle. That's pretty much all you need to be able to say for this. Okay, so now we're going to talk about hemodynamic shifts that occur and the changes that they impart upon our cardiac pressure volume loop. So the first of this one is we have increased preload in our left ventricle. As we well know, preload is more blood returning to the heart, as we think about it in terms of a blood pressure perspective. To become a little bit more specific, in this situation, we will call preload as left ventricular preload, the amount of blood that is in the ventricle before systole. Our previous cardiac pressure volume loop, lurking in here in grey, and our A point was there and our B point was here. However, now we have an increased volume at the B point at the end of diastolic filling, and subsequently, if you recall our end diastolic pressure volume relationship, we have got an increased left ventricular end diastolic pressure as well as an increased left ventricular end diastolic volume. So the loop has shifted to the right. Another way to describe it is that the loop has shifted up the end diastolic pressure volume relationship line. With it, we can also demonstrate that the stroke volume has gone up from our original 70 mils to something nearing 85. And Starling's forces, another thing to consider is that our D point will have shifted further up our end systolic pressure volume relationship line. It's also useful to eyeball here that our area has gone up, so our stroke work has gone up, so the myocardium is consuming more oxygen for this also. So that's preload. We get a right shift and increase in systolic and diastolic pressure because the D point tracks up the end systolic pressure volume relationship. Afterload, another physiological situation to consider is increasing afterload. So when we've done things to increase systemic vascular resistance. To try and visualize that there's a couple of big changes here. The B to C line, this fellow, has very much lengthened, and this is because if you've got higher resting diastolic pressure, then before the cardiac myocytes can begin shortening, they have to exert sufficient pressure to start emptying the left ventricle. So it takes longer, takes more pressure before you can start emptying the LV. And because we've spent more time exerting force to begin emptying, we are higher up the end systolic pressure volume relationship, and we've ended up here at the end of our rapid ventricular ejection. Naturally, this situation means that our stroke volume is reduced because our left ventricular end systolic volume has gone up, which is this here, LV end systolic volume has gone up, okay? Which means we've got a reduced stroke volume. So there are advantages and disadvantages to increasing afterload, and if you were to take this diagram to the extremes and squeeze that patient on ITU at 2 in the morning thinking you're doing the best thing ever with your quad strength NORAD to get their blood pressure nice and good, you compromise their cardiac output because you compromise your stroke volume. So you can't do things in isolation and expect them to make everything better. There's a degree of balance to strike between all these interventions. So now we'll play a bit with contractility. So for ongoing learning, you need to think about the fact that we can increase contractility by optimizing the internal milieu of the myocardium. Contractility is influenced by a number of factors. This includes your acid-base state. So we'll just draw a pesky hydrogen ion or a OH minus. Your electrolyte state, so your calcium, your sodium, your potassium, your magnesium, all have varying influences on myocardial contractility. Drugs, and these can be depressant or stimulator. You have adrenalines. So all these things can influence how happy your myocardium is, and therefore how contracty your myocardium is. Alongside, you need sufficient blood flow to the myocardium, and you need sufficient flow to the ventricle itself, because it won't squeeze if it's empty. So now coming to the actual pressure volume loop. As the gradient changes, i.e. as your contractility changes, you empty your myocardium more. Now, the important thing to recall here is you've not changed systemic vascular resistance directly if we're treating this in isolation. So the point at which your LV begins to empty, i.e. the pressure at which it begins to empty, remains the same. However, the red line is our change line here. The rate of ejection is more rapid, so you more rapidly achieve pressure and emptying, because you've got more contractility, you empty more. And that's why we are displaced slightly to the left with increased contractility. And we have a slightly lower end systolic and diastolic volume. That's the door. We're going to look at failing contractility. So this could be broken down into systolic or diastolic failure. If you could think about systolic failure as a failure of contractility. So we're going to be looking at our end systolic pressure volume relationship curve sinking off that way. And because of that, the amount of contractility has dropped. Therefore, the amount of emptying has decreased. Because emptying decreases, the left ventricular end systolic volume, i.e. how much is left at the end of a contraction, goes up. And that means that you end up climbing the end diastolic pressure volume relationship curve. This fellow just generally is all bad news. It means that you eject less per contraction. Your stroke volume is likely to go down. This fellow here. Your heart is more dilated because you've climbed up this. All bad news. If we then think about a diastolically failing heart, i.e. a heart that is really stiff and we're not making much progress in it relaxing at the end of systole in order to refill, then the end diastolic pressure volume relationship curve, the EDPVR, goes up. If in this hypothetical situation, remember we're hypothetical here because multiple things influence multiple things, and if one thing changes in isolation, it will change something else in isolation, as you well know. Nothing really happens in an independent manner in physiology. But for this example, we will stick with an unchanged systolic function of the heart, an unchanged contractility of the heart. As you ascend, as you climb in stiffness of ventricle, as your end diastolic pressure volume relationship curve climbs up, you end up with a heart that starts with a higher left ventricular end diastolic pressure, but a lower volume for the amount of pressure that is. So as your end diastolic pressure volume relationship swings up and round, as that gradient changes, you get an increase in end diastolic pressure, but a decrease in end diastolic volume. So your ventricle can't fill up as much. Your contractility stays the same, and you eject to the same degree, i.e. you get back to that same line because your end systolic pressure volume relationship hasn't changed. Because filling is impaired, your stroke volume goes down. So that is everything about left ventricular pressure volume loops. So I hope I've achieved those learning objectives. We've drawn a loop, we've labelled it, we've described what it represents, and we've explained how it changes. If you thought this video was useful, please leave me some comments. If you've got questions, please leave some comments. I'm certainly game to get back to you and have a delightfully exciting chat about cardiac pressure volume loops. Well, hey, thanks everyone. And that was James with Gas, Gas, Gas.